Good afternoon. My name is Angel Russell, and I serve as the Outreach Manager in Congresswoman Spanberger's Henrico office. I am very, very happy to see all of you and meet the leaders that are on this call. Thank you so much for joining today's call. It's our first faith and community leaders call that we're having, where Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger and her special guest, Congressman James Clyburn, will discuss how Congress is going to meet and is meeting this historic moment we're in right now, and also answer questions from leaders on the call. With that said, over to you, Congresswoman Spanberger.
Thank you so much, Angel. And I'm so grateful for all of you who are able to join us for this conversation. I'm grateful to Congressman Clyburn, the whip of the Democratic Party, for joining us. I was also so very appreciative in 2018 when Congressman Clyburn traveled to our district and we had a meeting in Spotsylvania on the ground. So some of you might have been present for that. But I'm grateful for his leadership and his lifelong commitment to equal justice and opportunity, both at home in South Carolina and across our country. So I'm going to begin, share a few thoughts, and then turn it over to our special guest, Congressman Clyburn. As of right now, we are facing significant challenges in our country. And just over the weekend, I had the opportunity to join many of our Central Virginia neighbors at Virginia Union University's Juneteenth celebration, a rally for justice. When we're reflecting coming out of this weekend on the tradition that is Juneteenth, it's a tradition that tells two stories, the story of both oppression and then the story of liberation. And it is a reminder for all of us to be focused on the continued effort to fight for equal rights and equal justice. And the issues that have persisted for generations throughout our country since the days of slavery are issues that require a complete and significant focus. And I am proud that now 155 years later from the time of the first Juneteenth, that there is a significant focus in the House of Representatives. There always has been, but we have a real vocal time in history where we see individuals rallying for justice and marching in the streets, advocating for equality, for racial justice and equity, and bringing a voice to the voiceless and generations of those who have not been able to achieve what is the promise of this country. Across our country, millions have marched for equal rights. They've marched for justice, for George Floyd, for Breonna Taylor, and in honor of many other Black men and women who have been killed either by law enforcement or by those who felt that they would be immune to repercussions because of who their victims were. And across the board, while we are rallying because of George Floyd's murder and Breonna Taylor's murder, issues of injustice and disparity exist across the board in maternal mortality rates, in healthcare, in education, in what is a shared favorite topic, broadband internet issues that Congressman Clyburn and I, that's a shared priority, and I thank him for his immense leadership on this issue. But right now, the House is responding with the Justice and Policing Act, which is a bill that was introduced by Congresswoman Karen Bass. She is the head of the Congressional Black Caucus, a leader in Congress, and her work has been so supported by congressional leadership, including Whip Clyburn. And this bill is a response to the needs of what we need to see within our policing. There are reforms and a prioritization on changing the way police and communities interact. As a former federal law enforcement officer myself, I know that there are throughout our communities a diverse an array of ideas about how we get to some of the challenges facing our communities. But the Justice and Policing Act does make significant and long overdue changes to our police forces, such as banning chokeholds, banning no-knock warrants, preventing and prohibiting law enforcement at all levels from racially profiling, establishing a nationwide police misconduct registry, creating local commissions and task force so that communities can work together with their law enforcement to improve public safety, reforming qualified immunity, and limiting the transfer of military-grade weapons. Now, for those on the call who are from Central Virginia, many of our localities already ban chokeholds and already ban no-knock warrants because leaders of our local police departments have recognized that they put folks in the community at risk. And so I'm proud to be supporting a bill that can bring some of those changes to communities across the country to ensure that people are, that law enforcement is not utilizing tactics that really can create major challenges within our community. And I mentioned Congresswoman Karen Bass, who is the one who led and introduced this bill. She is the chairwoman of the Congressional Black Caucus, and she has been working on these issues for years. And she hasn't been doing it alone. She hasn't been working on issues of justice and equity alone. She's been doing it with the strength of other members of Congress, and in particular, our special guest here today, Whip Clyburn. Whip Clyburn is the third-ranking Democrat in the United States House of Representatives, and he is the chairman of the House Select Committee on the Coronavirus Crisis. This select committee was has announced an investigation into COVID-19 outbreaks at nursing homes. And for those on the call here in Central Virginia, the outbreaks that we are seeing and have seen in our nursing homes have been particularly tragic, as we have witnessed the death of so many of our neighbors in these circumstances. Whip Clyburn is also the chairman of the Rural Broadband Task Force, and I am proud to serve alongside him. And he's the chair of the Democratic Faith Working Group. And I'm delighted that he's able to join us today, that he'll be sharing some thoughts and his experiences. My hope is that you'll be able to hear some of his stories, some of his experiences, and then he and I will both answer your questions. Though I told him in advance of this, I'm sure many of you want to hear from him more than you want to hear from me. So I'm grateful to have the opportunity to bring him to so many of the folks that I represent, so that you have the ability to understand who are the leaders in the Democratic caucus, who are the leaders in Congress, and who are the folks I'm so grateful to have the honor to work with on a day-to-day basis. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Congressman Clyburn. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks to all of you who are joining with us today. It's an interesting time of day to be talking to faith and community leaders, but coming on the heels of our day of religious activities for most people, and the weekend after the celebration of Juneteenth, and of course several days after the 5th anniversary of the Emmanuel 9, that we call them, those 9 souls who lost their lives doing Bible study at Emmanuel AME Church 5 years ago, all of which bring us to some significant thoughts about what's going on around us today. As was mentioned, I am chairing now the House's Select Committee on COVID-19. This committee has its responsibility to try and follow the expenditures that Congress is making to respond to COVID-19, to make sure that those expenditures are made efficiently, effectively, and equitably. And I think that's very, very important for us to keep in mind. If it's efficient, fine. If it's effective, fine. But the question is, are these expenditures being made equitably? So that's a big part of my job these days, and I'm trying to make sure that our response meet the test, of that 3-pronged test that I just mentioned. I also, of course, chair the Rural Broadband Task Force, and Abigail's been working very closely with us, with that task force. That's important, and it's the importance of that effort is being revealed to us as we try to respond to this pandemic. We know that we have seen the exposure of some inadequacies in our healthcare delivery system. That's why we're seeing in communities of color, more people contracting the virus, and more people are dying from it based upon skin color. And so what we've got to do is make sure that we can get healthcare delivered to people and their communities in a very, what I call, that's adequate, and not just adequate, but is accessible and is affordable. It's one thing to have access to broadband, it's something else to be able to afford broadband. So we are working very hard to try and get a broadband bill through the Congress. And I'm very pleased that the Speaker is putting broadband at the center of this infrastructure effort that we are now developing. We're going to try to build out. It will cost us around $86 billion to build out broadband 100% throughout the country. That's our goal, to make sure that broadband is available for everybody. Because even if you would cure the health problems with broadband, we still have a problem with education. I don't know about Virginia, but in South Carolina, we have just been told that a lot of our students who did not have school for the last half of this past school year, they're not going to be able to go on to the next grade because they have not been able to meet the proficiency tests that have been given to them. The ones who have been able to meet the test are the ones who had online learning. And if you are in a home where you don't have the internet, then you are not able to keep up with online learning. We've got to do something about that, because we could very well lose another year of school if this virus comes back in the fall, as everybody, not everybody, but most experts said that it will. So these things highlight some problems that we have to work on. I remember, I often tell this, and since a lot of faith people are with us today, I happen to have grown up in a parsonage. I didn't follow my father to the ministry. I tell everybody that I was always told that you have to be called to the ministry. And I kept listening, and I never heard the call. I'm not saying I didn't get it. I never heard it. So I did not follow him into the ministry. But he said to me, when I told him that I was not going to go to the seminary, as we had often talked about, he told me on that day, Russell, he said, I suspect the world would much rather see a sermon than to hear one. And so what I have tried to do is to make sure that in my service, that everybody sees a good, productive sermon. And one of those sermons came from a testimony that was given by a farmer in rural Tennessee back when we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of rural electrification. This farmer stood up in church one evening and said these words: brothers and sisters, I want to tell you this. The greatest thing on earth is to have the love of God in your heart. And the next greatest thing is to have electricity in your house. Now, that was the greatest thing for the 20th century. We know what rural electrification did for rural America. I maintain that the greatest thing for the 21st century, the next greatest thing for the 21st century, is to have broadband in every home. That's how we're going to get healthcare to everybody. That's how we're going to get education to everybody. That's how we're going to get economic development opportunities, by connecting everybody to the rest of the world. So I feel very strongly about that, and I'm very pleased to have Abigail work alongside me on that issue. Let me close with this, and I'll answer any questions you may have. I'll respond to them. I'll ask Abigail to answer the question. I'll respond to them. You know, I think that when we see the exposures that we've seen, the injustices that we have seen in our judicial system, it reminds me a lot of a visitor to this country.
I saw your text message. I'm out handing out literature.
It reminds me of an issue that brought about by a visitor to this country. I think somebody needs to go on mute. Okay, thank you. I was about to say, Alexis de Tocqueville visited this country back in the 1830s. He really came here to study our judicial system. But while he was here, he discovered a certain magic about the country and set out to find out what it was that made this country so magical. He came to the conclusion that America is not great because it's more enlightened than any other nation, but rather because it's always been able to repair its faults. We know from COVID-19 that there are some fault lines that have developed or been exposed in our healthcare delivery system. And we've got to demonstrate the greatness of this country by repairing that fault line. A fault line has been exposed in our judicial system. And we know, and Representative Spanberger has already highlighted what this Justice and Policing Act will do. And I want to say this. I know we hear it a lot, and I'm sure you've heard it, especially in the African American community. I hear people talking all the time. What is it you all do? What's the Congressional Black Caucus? I don't know of anything that you all really do. Well, let me just explain something to you. If you look at the Justice and Policing Act, it's kind of interesting. It outlaws the chokehold. Hakeem Jeffries has been pushing legislation to outlaw the chokehold ever since he's been in the Congress. It also outlaws what we call militarization of police forces. Hank Johnson from Georgia has been pushing legislation trying to get those tanks and other weapons of war out of police departments ever since he's been in the Congress. And he's been there more than 10 years. So if you look at this legislation, Cedric Richmond has been working on qualified immunity forever. I have been working on profiling. Walter Scott lost his life because of racial profiling. We tried to close what we now call a Charleston loophole after those 9 souls lost their lives at the Emmanuel Church 5 years ago. We've passed these bills in the House. H.R. 1112 allows for a substantial background check to be made because Dylan Roof, who killed those people, should not have had the gun. But because of a loophole in the law, he got the gun. And we've been trying to close that loophole forever, and it's passed the House. You can't get it through the Senate. So when you look at this legislation, you're going to see things that the caucus, the Black Caucus, has been doing forever. All of a sudden now, because of the recent issues, recent occurrences, people are now saying, all of a sudden, you're doing something. No, all of a sudden, you're paying attention to what we've been trying to do for a long time. So let me close by saying, especially to those of you from the faith community. Now, although I didn't follow my father into the ministry, I still study the Bible. You can go in one of my bedsides, any office, and you're going to find 3 books. If you don't find anything else, you're going to find a dictionary, a thesaurus, and a Bible. And I study the Bible for historical context. And I remember when Nancy Pelosi asked me to chair the House Democrats' Faith Working Group. I demurred. I told her I thought she ought to get one of the ministers in our caucus to do it. She was a little bit persistent, as only Nancy Pelosi can be. So I went to talk to my pastor, tell him what was being asked of me, and I asked him what he thought I should do. Joe Darby said to me, "I'm not going to tell you what to do. Why don't you go back and reread the book of James?" Now, James has always been my favorite book of the Bible, not just because of my name, but because it's such a short book of the Bible. You can read all 5 chapters in one sitting and think you've done something. So I went back and I reread it. When I got there in the 2nd chapter, I saw what my pastor was trying to tell me. But I went back to him and I says, "Look, I see what you're trying to tell me. But let's talk about this a little bit. Let's talk about what James had on his mind. Why did he write that epistle?" And those of you who went to the seminary, and some of others may remember from your studies, that James wrote that epistle about 44 years after Christ had ascended, and his purpose was to give some instructions to the people of faith. And he said to them that you couldn't just testify, express your beliefs, you had to show your faith. And his whole thing was summed up there in the 2nd chapter. If your brother or sister come to you hungry or naked, it's not enough to tell them to go in faith. It's not enough to just pray for them. You feed them and you clothe them, because faith without works is dead. That's what our caucus, that's what our Congress, that's what our government should be about. We should be about clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, doing good to those, even those who may say ill things about you. So our government has to depend upon a commitment that all of us should have to keeping the faith. So I want to thank all of you who are participating here today. Thank you, Representative Spanberger, for inviting me to be here with you. And I'll try to respond to any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Clyburn. And to everybody on the call, we are so fortunate within the Democratic Caucus to have typically, we have weekly caucus meetings and weekly whip calls. And so I get to hear from this gentleman multiple times a week, and sometimes in person when we are on Capitol Hill, and if not by caucus call. But I would like to open it up to questions so that we can begin the discussion. And again, I want to thank Congressman Clyburn for being here. And I'll just add a little bit of context. One of the things that Congressman Clyburn does, and I believe this is the tradition every time there's a new freshman class in Congress, is he welcomes us to the African American History Museum. And new members of Congress go, and we eat dinner together, we hear stories and have a discussion with him, and then we have special tours through the museum. And I don't think I've had the opportunity to share this with you, Congressman, but it was one of the most powerful events that as a new member of Congress we were able to participate in, because we are looking at and talking about the foundations of this country, the promises that were made, that were not fulfilled, that were delayed. And to be able to begin our term in Congress with that background, and certainly with the ability to sit shoulder to shoulder and hear directly from someone like you, who for so many of us was a figure on TV or a figure in the news before we were ever elected, was a really powerfully important way to begin our term. So I share that story so that you all recognize and hear some of the deeds and the way he leads, because I think it's relevant to the way that we might further this conversation for the rest of us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much. We have received some questions ahead of time via email. Thank you so much for submitting those. So the first question is coming from Dr. Shedrick McCall. Dr. McCall, would you like to ask your question about the George Floyd video?
Yes, I had asked, given everything that's going on, I said, once you happen to see that particular video, what kind of emotions did it bring, and what did you think when you saw that particular video of George Floyd being murdered?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Quite frankly, what it did for me, it conjured up Emmett Till. You know, I really got very emotional when I saw it, because I can't tell you how many times in my life I've wondered. Emmett Till, his mother, Miss Mobley, made a decision when his body got back to Chicago that she was going to have an open casket funeral. And when she made them keep the casket open, and people saw how he had been mutilated before being shot, I thought about that, and now I've often wondered throughout my life what he went through before he was put to death. I can only imagine what all he went through, a young teenager. And that's what I thought about when I saw George Floyd, that what he was going through had to be a lot like what Emmett Till must have gone through. And I know that open casket had a tremendous impact on the whole world. I have 3 daughters, and it's 11 years between my oldest and my youngest. And the youngest was giving me a little bit of a challenge when I was trying to get her to understand some of the real world. And the night I made her sit down and watch Eyes on the Prize. I don't know if you all have seen it, but Eyes on the Prize is a statement that John Lewis loves to make. Keep your eyes on the prize. Well, that movie was, I think it was a PBS documentary. When my daughter sat down to watch that with me, I was having a little bit of a problem with her keeping her attention until she saw that open casket. And when she saw that open casket, I have not had a single problem getting her to understand anything since. Angela had a transformation when she saw that. And so that's what I thought about. I think this country had a real transformation when they saw those 8 minutes and 46 seconds of a knee to the neck of George Floyd. So I think that episode proves the point. One picture is worth 1,000 words. That picture is going to stay in a lot of people's minds for a long time.
Congresswoman, would you like to respond to that as well?
That is a difficult act to follow, but I would just add, Dr. McCall, that watching the brutality of George Floyd's death, the murder of a human, and frankly, hearing him call for his mother, I don't think anyone who's watched that video can go back in time and can erase what they've heard or what they've seen. And I think each of us have a voice and an ability to make an effort and make a change. And for those of us who are in elected office, it's through legislation. For those of you in the ministry, it's with your congregations. For those who are community leaders, either with organizations or within the larger community, I think it is a call for all of us to keep moving, and use the depravity and the brutality of his death as a motivation to do it in his honor, and frankly in the honor of every person who's been murdered before him and long before Emmett Till.
Thank you so much. Our next question is coming from Pastor Emmanuel Harris. Reverend Harris, would you like to ask your question about community review boards?
Yes, thank you, Congressman and Congresswoman Spanberger. The question I have is, during this hour of chaos, my concern is that the action will be just symbolic. But I've had conversations with the sheriff in Goochland County and some other sheriffs as well. You know, the trust in the African-American community for the police, it has waned to almost nothing. So what's your position on community review boards so police don't regulate themselves? That they have to set up an independent civilian or community review board with subpoena power. That way the police are not policing like themselves and investigating like themselves. There's a mandatory structure that says you have to be held accountable to somebody else in the community. And as you said before, many of these ideas are not new ideas. They have been around for a long time, but they've never become law. And during this hour, I want to ensure they become law. And the question is, you know, can it be federal law, state law, or local law? Because depending upon where you are, it may be a slim chance of it becoming law if you're in a certain area with a certain like demographic. I'll try to talk in code, but but what's the chances of that becoming a universal law so the police don't police themselves and they're held accountable in the whole country?
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Harris. Let me just say that your code is very easy to decipher. So even I can understand what you're saying. Well, you've got two problems with that. The first one being, I don't believe you can do a federal law to accomplish that. It has to be state and local review board. That is one of the reasons in writing the Justice in Policing Act that you notice we talk about no knock being outlawed as it relates to federal drug arrests or investigations, because you get in a very tricky area. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but you get in a very tricky area when you get outside of your purview. Our purview is federal offenses. And if it's a state or local offense, I don't know that we can outlaw that. Now, if you call even when we went to voting, I was having this discussion, I think it was yesterday, with somebody about the voting problems that we are looking to experience this year. And I was saying to them that even when it came to voting, when you're dealing with the federal law, it's a little bit different because we've always delegated elections to be run by local authorities. If you remember when the voting age was lowered to 18, we had to lower it for federal elections. But what happened was the states were hard pressed to set up two systems. So they then moved to lower it to 18 for state elections. When we first lowered the voting age to 18, it pertained only to federal elections because that's all that we had the authority to do. So I would hope, as many communities have done, that these independent review boards are there. Nobody wants to get rid of policing. That's why I was so strong in the statements I made after the cry went out for defund the police. Now, when people tell me, well, you know what we really mean, I say to them, no, you got to say what you mean. Because if you start trying to explain what you mean, you are losing the argument. So don't say things you don't mean, because a headline will kill you. Now, some of you, I'm looking here, I don't think any of you there are old as I am, so you may not remember what killed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. John Lewis and I first met in October 1960. We were both down in Atlanta, Georgia, on Morehouse campus. It was also the same weekend I met Martin Luther King Jr. For the first time. We were being very successful, desegregating lunch counters, integrating public transit, doing the things that were necessary to implement Brown v. Board of Education, which came down in 1954. All of a sudden, we woke up one morning and the headline was, "Burn, baby, burn." That hijacked the entire movement. And John and I talk about that a lot to this day, how that movement got hijacked. And so what I was saying is, let's not allow sloganeering to hijack this movement. I see and feel things today regarding the nation's and the world's reaction to George Floyd. It is unlike anything that we succeeded with back in the 60s. I don't want to see it get hijacked. I would love for us to stay focused on these issues. Let's reform the police. Let's outlaw all these things we just talked about. Let's get broadband into every community. Let's make sure that infrastructure is more than a road or a bridge or a rail system or a port. Make sure that broadband is in every infrastructure bill that we come out with. I think that's what we need to be doing. And so I don't want to see this effort get hijacked because somebody comes out with some slogan that frightens people out of the off of the effort, and we'll be back to where we started from.
Thank you, Congressman Clyburn. And Reverend Harris, I would like to add just one thing, drilling down specifically on this bill. And I appreciate Congressman Clyburn's talking about actual actions and not sloganeering. And as somebody who is in a district where I've had to explain quite a bit what other people mean by the words they use, I appreciate his total clarity on this issue. In the Justice and Policing Act, there is a portion of it where it builds on what had been President Obama's 21st century study on policing and police reform. And so an element of this, it does set up, it requires the Department of Justice to collect data related to infractions, biographic and demographic information on who is on the receiving end of force, if they're an officer or if it's a community member. And then looking at racial distribution of drug charges, use of deadly force by law enforcement, and then traffic and pedestrian stops. It also establishes a Department of Justice task force to coordinate investigation, prosecution, and enforcement of federal, state, and local governments in cases related to law enforcement misconduct. So this is an outside entity of assistance that can be available to localities, ideally providing additional resources. And then the bill would also create law enforcement development programs, provide best practices, and training and information related to bias and racial disparities within law enforcement.
Thank you. Our next question is coming from Omari Al-Qaddafi. Mr. Al-Qaddafi, if you could unmute and ask your question about housing.
Yeah, I do. Can you guys hear me?
I hear you.
Yeah,
Yes,
sorry.
sir.
I actually like lost power. It's storming, and I lost power like 5 minutes ago. So now I'm like in the car, and there's a lot of rain.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But yeah. So anyway, yeah, I do love the Justice and Policing Act. I looked through a lot of it, and I think that, some of the stuff about, qualified immunity, the National Police Registry for misconduct and use of force, the restrictions on militarization of the police, they were really great. I didn't like, well, I, I think I noticed that there was a 10% cap on the enforcement by restricting use of the burn grant, which was highlighted in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, as one of the ways that the justice system is used against Black people. But there's only a 10% cap in the Justice and Policing Act on those funds as a penalty for non-compliance. I think those could be a little higher, but and I just, those are just things that I thought of as, the Justice and Policing Act was brought up earlier in the conversation. I didn't really know that it would be brought up, but those are some things that I had noticed. And some of the enforcement, well, it seemed like other than that, the enforcement relies on the Attorney General of the state making the case or bringing charges against a non-compliant police department. And I wondered, would there be like positions available? Because if we're relying on the Attorney General, there could be a Attorney General who's not really, so friendly, or in someplace where they're not as friendly towards police accountability. So I think there probably would need to be someone staffed there who's specifically looking at Justice and Policing Act. Yeah, that was just something that came to my mind during the conversation. I submitted the question in regards to housing and wondering if there were any efforts coming out of on the table for housing that would be specifically focused to address, systemic racism and the legacy of that that's ongoing.
Well, thank you very much for your comments and your question. As for your comments, you're right that there are people debating that 10% cap. And I have not been in Washington. I won't be going back until Wednesday. I talked with Karen Bass as recent as this morning. And Cedric Richmond and I spoke over the weekend, all talking about this legislation, various aspects of it. And that 10% cap is something that is being discussed, and exactly how it will be resolved. I don't know, but I hope it will be to your satisfaction. And let me mention the patterns and practices that Representative Spanberger mentioned earlier. Many of you remember Ferguson. When the Congressional Black Caucus went to Ferguson after, what was his name, Brown, I'm blocking his first name at the moment, died in Ferguson. And if you remember, was left out in the street. His body was out in the street for a long time. It was very insulting to a lot of us. And we packed up and went to Ferguson. And we sat down. We didn't seek headlines. We didn't hold press conferences. But the young lady who just got elected mayor of Ferguson was in our meetings. We encouraged her to run for office, which she did, and she got elected to the town council in Ferguson. And now she's the new mayor of Ferguson. What we did, we went there and quietly put together organized efforts to try and respond the way we thought would evolve and be permanent. And I believe that what is taking place in Ferguson is an example of how we've been trying to do things at the Congressional Black Caucus. And this patterns and practice grew out of that. Barack Obama's administration went in and did a patterns and practice investigation in Ferguson to expose what was going on there. And many others. This current administration, I understand, there's only been one. Only been one. And so that's the difference. So you raise an issue that we're all working on, and Representative Spanberger highlighted that as well. But on the housing question, you cannot have a more fierce advocate for housing than Maxine Waters. Maxine Waters chairs the Financial Services Committee. That's where the housing legislation is in. And you may not have read this yet, but she has now gotten the House to adopt housing as an infrastructure issue. I talk a lot about broadband, but she talks about housing religiously. And housing is going to be a part of our infrastructure bill, because we believe very strongly that infrastructure projects should create jobs. And there's no better way to create a job than in affordable housing. Because when you build a house, you're putting carpenters to work, you're putting bricklayers to work, you're putting electricians to work, you're putting, you name it. Whatever goes into a house, you have people going to work. So she has successfully argued with the help of a lot of other people, but she's been very much on the point of making housing an infrastructure issue. And Peter DeFazio, who chairs that committee, has adopted her approach. And he's bringing into his legislation housing as a part of his efforts on infrastructure. But that goes back to what I said earlier. The kinds of stuff that you see coming out of the Congressional Black Caucus that we don't have press conferences about, what we try to do is make headway, not headlines. Making headway, and let somebody else do the headlines.
Thank you, Congressman Clyburn. All right, our next question is from Wendy Hobbs. Wendy, would you like to come on and ask your question regarding young people?
Good afternoon, Congressman
Hey, how are you?
Clyburn and my friend, Congresswoman Spanberger. Thank you for this opportunity. My question is that we have a great movement going on, and we're protesting and marching because we want change. My question to both of you is, after we protest, after we marched and removed Confederate statues, what would you tell young people they need to do to continue the implementation of change in our country?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I tell young people all the time that we got to get involved in the process. It's one thing to highlight the issue. It's something else to develop an approach to eradicating the problems. And we are never, ever going to change the system from the outside. We got to get people into the system. And I try everything I can in my own way. I've created 5-6 years ago something I call the Clyburn Fellows. Now, I didn't name it that. Jamie Harrison, that some of you have been reading about, who is now running for the United States Senate and doing a great job, I might say. The last poll that I saw had Jamie Harrison tied with the incumbent in that Senate race. And last quarter, the first quarter of this year, he outraised the incumbent by almost $1 million. And I think he's going to outraise him the second quarter. Jamie Harrison came to me and said, look, we got to get more young people involved in this process. And he says, I would propose that we create a sort of a fellowship to bring young people in at a very early age, teach them as much as we can about what the political process is all about. And his whole idea was to have this a year-long program that young people get involved in. And he was the one to select 40 a year. And so I told him I thought it was a great idea. He came back to me later and says, I'm going to implement it. I said, good. When you going to get started? He said, as soon as you write me this check. So, so that's how I got to be Clyburn Fellows. He made me, I wrote him a pretty big check to get the program started. And I've been writing checks ever since because the program is now just finished its 5th year, 40 young people a year. And I am very proud of the fact that many of those Clyburn Fellows are in the state legislature now. They're on school boards, getting involved in the process and changing. And the thing that made me more proud than anything else is a young lady in that program ran for the city council in Rock Hill, South Carolina. She got the highest number of votes anybody has ever gotten in the history of the Rock Hill City Council. So what we're trying to do is get young people to understand that when these issues get highlighted, whatever method they may be used to highlight them, we then need to go to work to get things implemented. And the only way to do that is to be inside that system. So we're having tremendous good luck here in South Carolina. I think that's why Jamie Harrison is doing so well, because he's got about 200 people that came through that fellowship program that's out there working for him every day. So us old guys provide him whatever knowledge we can and whatever resources we can. And these young people who are involved in this effort, they're making a big difference. And so my thing is, my daddy's tell me all the time, son, you learn to do by doing. No matter how many times you study the theory, if you don't go out and put the theory to practice, you'll never learn how to do it. And so that's the theory that we've been having with these young people. Staying focused, staying steady, leading by precept and example. We got a lot of people who will announce the precept. We got to get some people who will provide some examples. So that's what we're trying to do with these young people. And so I think we have to just take the time that it takes to get young people involved in the process and help them along. Don't tell them how to do it. Bring them into the process and let them fail a few times. They'll wake up.
And I would add part of the important piece is making sure that young people know that their voices matter, that their opinions matter, and that wherever they decide to engage, if it is as an advocate, if it is as somebody who cares about the politics of it and getting people they support elected, or if it's advocating for policies that they care about, recognizing that young people need to use their voice, they need to use it consistently, but also back to what Congressman Clyburn said earlier, when we came out with the Justice and Policing Act, and I say we only as a member of Congress, not because I had any major impact there, but his point is such a strong one, which is this wasn't something that happened in a day. This is something that Hakeem Jeffries and Cedric Richmond and Karen Bass and Congressman Clyburn had been working on consistently for years and years. And there was a time when talking about banning chokeholds just wasn't at the tip of everyone's tongue. It wasn't in people's consciousness. But Congressman Jeffries was consistent, and he was able to push forth what was his priority because of his consistency and his work. And so outwardly, it might seem a man died in the street and we banned chokeholds, but that's in fact not what happened. And I think it's important that particularly young people recognize, even looking at the civil rights movement throughout history, that it takes persistence and a focus to make change, and that things don't happen in a day, and we should fight for them like they could. And maybe here and there we see changes more consistently, but that persistence is important, because progress is not, there's no finish line in progress in our society and in our community or in the world. It is an issue where, and sometimes it's a relay where you're running, and you might pass the baton to somebody else, but we have to keep going. So I think it's so important that they recognize that it isn't about taking down one statue or passing one bill. It's about the fact that we have seized on a moment where the public is fully engaged with this issue, and we are going to move forward on this issue of justice and policing. But if we don't get at equity issues in healthcare and in education and in housing, we haven't actually rooted out some of the baseline foundational issues in our society that actually cause the bias that exists, that cause or contribute to the bias that exists, the challenges that exist, the lack of opportunity that exists, that creates the foundation of disruption. And as Congressman Clyburn said, the cracks that become so clear, be it in issues of racial justice or health justice and equity, like what we've seen with COVID. And so I think we are running very, very low on time. I want to say thank you again to Congressman Clyburn for joining, and I will turn it back to him for any closing remarks. To all of the community leaders, religious leaders, activists and advocates on the call, thank you for joining. I look forward to continuing the conversation, but at this time, I'm going to give it back to our special guest, Congressman Clyburn, to close us out.
Well, let me thank you once again for allowing me to be a part of this, and thanks to all of you who have joined us here today. I really believe that our country is at an inflection point. I had a Zoom call this morning with an industry, Cox Enterprises. They own some pretty big television stations and other media, as well as automobile. It's a pretty big enterprise. And I said to them, what I would like to close with here today, that we have to keep in mind that our country never stands still. The country is always moving. Sometimes it moves from left to right, and then it moves right back left. And it's always moving like the pendulum on a clock. Left to right for a while, then it goes back right to left for a while. But we have to keep in mind that when the country is going from left to the right, it passes through the center. When it goes from right back left, it passes through the center. The moral there is that this country camps out in the center much more than it camps out right or left. And that's what keeps things a bit stable. I think all of us know this country has moved politically to a dangerous point to the right. And what we've got to do is get this country back to the center. And there's only one way to do that at this particular juncture, and that is to participate in this election process going forward. Be it your church, your sorority, your fraternity, your Masonic order, whatever it may be, we should all start now to organizing. Start now to adopting precincts. Start now to say that this fraternity of mine, my chapter, is going to adopt this precinct, and my job is going to be to make sure that everybody in this precinct votes, because there are forces out there this year that are doing whatever they can to suppress this vote. They're doing what they can to make sure that we do not have an unfettered election. And so let's start now. Let's not wait until the day before the election. I've started 2 months ago organizing to make sure that we get a good turnout here. Jamie ain't gonna lose this election because Jim Clyburn didn't try. Abigail Spanberger should not lose an election because you didn't try. Let's do everything that we possibly can to make sure that no matter how great the forces are that's trying to keep there from being a fair and proper election, we're going to overcome them with sheer will, tenacity, and hard work. So thank y'all so much for all that you do and what I know you're going to do between now and November 3rd. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Congressman Clyburn. I could listen to you talk for hours and hours.
That's okay. Thank you.
So
that's only because you're from South Carolina, right?
That's it. I'm ready for our sweet tea and some cornbread and let's keep talking. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for to Congresswoman Spanberger for even setting this call up and making this a priority. Thank you all to the leaders, to the activists, to the faith leaders also for joining us on this call today. I want to reiterate how your work and your participation is vital towards progress, and our office will continue to remain in contact with you as we think about steps forward, but also please make sure you remain in contact with us if you think of ways that we could be useful in the community as we all fight towards justice. So thank you so much for joining us. We're going to end the call here, but we really appreciate your participation and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you very much.